we're gonna do the 21 lead for the full 21 this time. So once you're comfortable with the sleep measurements, it's really just adding on a few extra steps. And there's just a couple key differences for how we measure certain electrodes. So again, the first measurement you're gonna make is Nasion to Inion. Same first three steps as you do in sleep. We're gonna make a mark at 50%, and then 10%, 10%. 10% up from the Nasion, 10% up from the Inion. With the addition of, we are now also going to measure 20% down from CZ. You can either measure 20% down or 20% up from your first mark that you made for FPZ, but essentially what we're doing is making our first mark for FC and then for PZ in the back. So 20% of this measurement, of the full measurement. Again, whenever you do a percentage, it's always of the full measurement and not of a percentage of a percentage. So you should have 5 marks in total along the Nasion to Inion plane. Now, how you're going to check your work is you are going to measure between CZ and FPZ. Half of the distance between these two should be right around where your FC is marked. Same thing with CZ and OZ. Halfway between the distance should be right around where your PZ was first made. So check your work as you go, because it's a lot easier to fix mistakes earlier on than to keep going and then you don't know where you made the mistake. So always check your work. So that's why we do 20%, and then also do the other way of finding those points, which is halfway between these two. If they're more than, I would say, a ½ centimeter off, you might want to go back and remeasure or check your math and make sure you didn't make a mistake somewhere. Preauricular, same measurement that you made in sleep. Measure your preauricular, making sure your measuring tape goes through the first 50% mark that you made. %10 up on each side from both preauricular points, and 20% down from your CZ. Again, double check your work as you go. Measure between CZ and your T3, your first mark for T3. The first line you made for C3 should be right around halfway between those 2 points. Same thing on the other side. Check your work as you go. Next measurement, cross mark your FPZ. Stare the patient straight on. Measure your circumference, making sure that it goes through all 4 of your 10% marks that you made. FPZ, OZ, T3, T4. Okay. So we're going to measure for FP1, FP2, just like we do in sleep, 5% of the circumference one way, 5% of the circumference the other. Double check your work. Measure between those 2 points you just made. If they are not 10% of their circumference apart, or right around there, then you made a mistake somewhere. Cross mark them, use your measuring tape as a straight edge ruler. So this is where we deviate from the sleep measurements. We are not cross marking OZ. There's a lot of points made for the 21 lead measurement, and so the less marks that we need to make, the better. So do not cross OZ at this point. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to start and work your way back from one of your FPs and kind of work your way back around the head. So you're going to start at FP2, measure 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%, start back up at FP1 and do the same. Always making sure though that you're lining your measuring tape up with the next measuring tape, so you're not just kind of doing some type of drift around the head. So if I'm lining my 0 up at FP1, I'm also lining up the line with my first mark for T3. So I'm going to make a mark at 10%. And then for me, it's just easier to not move my hands and mark 20%. And that should cross mark your T3. Realigning my 0 with the new cross mark T3, lining the measuring tape up with the line I made for OZ, and I'm doing the same thing. 10%, 10%. Starting at the other side, I'm going to work my way back doing the same thing. So again, 10%, 10%, 10%, 10%. This time I'm starting at FP2. lining my measuring tape up with the mark I made for T4, lining the 0 back up with the now cross-marked T4, and my measuring tape back up with OZ back here. So again, you don't start to just drift off into space when you're making these measurements. All right, so now's the time to check your work. Measure between O1 and O2. They should be 10% of the circumference apart. If they aren't, now we need to go back and recheck where the mistakes were made. So what you can do now, if you need to, measure for OZ. Measure 50% of the way back, cross mark your OZ, and then that'll give you a better idea which side is off. So then that way you're not refixing a side that's perfect. If one side is more off than the other, then you know to focus your measurements and recheck those sides on the other side. We're gonna go with it. So I'm gonna cross mark my O1, O2 by using my measuring tape as a straight edge ruler. And so at this point, I have a lot of cross marked points along the circumference. I have FP1, FP2, T3, T4, O1, O2. So it's just the points, F8, T6, T5, F7, that are not cross marked. But they have a cross marked point on the other side of each of them. So what you're gonna do is use your measuring tape as a straight edge ruler between one cross mark point and the next cross mark point, and you're going to cross mark these remaining 4 points along the circumference. Now notice I could have done this while I was making the initial measurement for them. I didn't. I wanted to make sure that my points were accurate before I took the extra step of cross marking them. So now all points along the circumference should be cross marked. And my next measurement I'm going to do is my bananas, going from FP1 through the mark for C3 to O1. At half, I'm cross marking my C3, and I'm also measuring between FP1, C3, make my first mark here. The difference is I'm doing it again in the back to apply the electrodes in the back as well. Same thing on the other side. So if you find that the left and the right are really far off, they're not the same, again, check your work. You made a mistake somewhere. The left and the right should pretty much be the same. Halfway between my C3 and my FP1, halfway between my O1 and my C3. All right, so now the last points that I need to do are the horseshoes. They don't really look like it here. That's this horseshoe going F7, F3, FZ, F4, F8, and then again in the background, your T5, P3, PZ, P4, T6. But when you look at them on the actual scalp, they're shaped like a horseshoe. So these ones are kind of probably more difficult ones to do because you really have to curve the measuring tape to go through all 4 points. So again, make a mark at half, and then I'm halfway between my PZ and this mark on the back as well. And the same thing in the front. So you're going from through all these 4 points. And again, halfway between these 2 points now. And at this point, after this mark is made, we should have all points cross-marked. Remember, a point is not complete until it's been cross-marked. And you want to cross-mark it on both the horizontal and the vertical plane to make sure that the points are complete. So just double check your work. So left side should be the same as right side. Each of these points should be equally spaced. You know, tends to be a lot of mistakes always happen more in the back with the horseshoes. So just if you start to track where you tend to be off, you can really start to figure out where you might need to be really more careful with what measurements you're making. And that's it.